The black Bentley glided through the iron gates 4 hours ahead of schedule. Charles Montgomery cut the engine in the curved driveway and sat in the afternoon stillness, staring at his Beverly Hills estate. The mansion looked perfect from the outside. Pristine white columns, manicured hedges, windows gleaming in the California sun. But Charles noticed what others didn't. The hairline crack running down the eastern wall, the paint peeling subtly near the service entrance. Beautiful surfaces hiding structural damage. He stepped out, the velvet box containing the Cartier earrings heavy in his coat pocket. The Paris deal had closed early, a victory worth celebrating. All through the transatlantic flight, he'd imagined Sylvia's face when he surprised her, the way her eyes would light up like they used to, back when she looked at him like he was more than just a bank account. Charles paused at the front steps, memories flooding back unbidden. He'd been 17 when his father died, leaving nothing but debts and a one-bedroom apartment in Koreatown that smelled like mildew and desperation. He remembered eating ramen for weeks, sleeping on the floor, working 3 jobs while taking night classes. He remembered the shame of showing up to business school orientation in a suit from Goodwill, watching his classmates arrive in their tailored Italian wool. He remembered the day he closed his first deal, 23 years old, hands shaking as he signed papers that would change everything. He remembered meeting Sylvia at a charity gala 2 years later, stunning in emerald silk, laughing at his jokes, making him feel like he'd finally arrived. Like he finally belonged. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of building something he thought was solid. 2 mansions, a yacht he barely used, more cars than he could drive. And Sylvia, beautiful, elegant Sylvia, at the center of it all, the perfect wife for a man who'd clawed his way up from nothing. The house was too quiet when he entered. Something felt off. "Mr. Charles!" Betty appeared at the top of the marble staircase, her face suddenly pale. She descended quickly, her hands wringing the edge of her apron. "You're home early." Sylvia didn't mention. "Closed the deal ahead of schedule." Charles smiled, holding up the velvet box. "Thought I'd surprise her." "Where is she?" "Still at the spa?" Betty's eyes flickered toward the second-floor hallway. Just for a moment. But Charles had built his empire by reading people, by catching the tells others missed. "Actually, sir, perhaps you should." But Charles was already moving past her, toward the stairs. His Italian leather shoes made no sound on the carpet runner. That's when he heard it, drifting through the partially open window at the end of the hall. His wife's voice, soft and playful in a way he hadn't heard directed at him in years. Then a man's laugh. Low. Familiar. Comfortable. Charles's breath caught in his throat. His hand gripped the banister, knuckles white. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Not their master bedroom. The guest suite. The one Sylvia said she'd been using because his snoring kept her awake. Behind him, Betty whispered something, a warning, maybe, or an apology. But Charles couldn't hear her over the blood pounding in his ears. He moved toward the door, one step, then another, the velvet box still clutched in his hand, like a talisman against the truth he could already feel crystallizing in his chest. He heard it again. That voice. That laugh. The sound of intimacy that should have been his alone. Charles reached for the door handle, and somewhere deep inside, in a place he'd spent 15 years pretending didn't exist, he already knew. Everything he'd built, the empire, the mansion, the perfect life, was about to crumble. And there was nothing his money could do to stop it. Charles turned the handle. The door swung open with a soft click that somehow sounded deafening in the stillness. Sylvia looked up from where she sat on the edge of the bed, her silk robe barely tied, her hair disheveled in a way that told him everything. Beside her, buttoning his shirt with fumbling fingers, was Marcus Chin, his business partner of 8 years. The man he trusted with half his empire. The man who'd been at their anniversary dinner just 3 months ago, raising a toast to their marriage. Time seemed to slow. Charles stood frozen in the doorway, the velvet box slipping from his fingers and hitting the hardwood floor with a dull thud. The diamond earrings spilled out, glittering obscenely in the afternoon light. "Charles!" Sylvia's voice was flat, almost bored. She didn't scramble to cover herself. Didn't gasp or apologize or even look particularly surprised. She simply sighed, as if he'd walked in on her reading a book she'd already finished. "You're early." The word caught in Charles's throat. He couldn't breathe. "I couldn't think." Marcus was already moving, grabbing his jacket, muttering something about being sorry, about it not meaning anything. Charles wanted to hit him. I wanted to scream. Wanted to do something, anything, but his body wouldn't respond. He just stood there, watching his business partner, his friend, rush past him and disappear down the hallway like a thief escaping into the night. "How long?" Charles finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Sylvia stood, tightening her robe with deliberate slowness. "Does it matter?" "How long, Sylvia?" 3 years. She said it like she was commenting on the weather. "Maybe 4. I honestly stopped keeping track." The words hit him like physical blows. 4 years. For years of lies while he worked himself to exhaustion to give her everything. For years of business dinners where Marcus sat across from them, smiling, shaking his hand. For years of sleeping in the master bedroom alone while she... "Why?" The word came out broken. Sylvia laughed, actually laughed. "Why?" "Charles, look at yourself. You're never here. When you are here, you're on your phone, closing deals, building your precious empire. Do you even remember the last time we had a real conversation? The last time you looked at me like I was more than just another asset you acquired. I gave you everything. You gave me things." Her voice turned sharp, cutting. "Houses, cars, jewelry I never asked for. But you were never really here. And honestly, I stopped caring years ago." Charles felt the room tilt. His legs threatened to give out beneath him. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be his life. "Mrs. Sylvia." Betty's voice came from behind him, steady despite the tremor he could hear underneath. "I'll pack your things. I think it's best if you leave." Sylvia's eyes narrowed at the maid. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Betty stepped forward, her small frame somehow commanding in that moment. "Pack your bags. Go stay at the Malibu house. Or don't. But you're not staying here. Not tonight." For the first time, Sylvia looked uncertain. She glanced at Charles, perhaps expecting him to defend her, to stop Betty from overstepping. But Charles couldn't speak. Couldn't move. He felt like he was watching this happen to someone else, like he'd stepped outside his own body and was observing the destruction of his life from a great distance. Sylvia grabbed her phone from the nightstand. "Fine. This place always felt like a museum anyway." She brushed past them both, and Charles caught the scent of her perfume, the one he'd bought her last Christmas. It made him want to vomit. When her footsteps faded down the stairs, Betty finally touched his arm. "Mr. Charles, you should sit down." He looked at her then, really looked at her. At the pain in her eyes. The guilt. "You knew." It wasn't a question. Betty's hand dropped. "Yes, sir. I knew. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because, sir." Her voice broke. "Because I was afraid this would destroy you. And I was right." The mansion had never felt so large. Charles sat in the dark living room at 3 in the morning, staring at nothing. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. The heating system clicked on and off. Sounds he'd never noticed before now seemed deafening in the silence. Sylvia had left that same evening, her Louis Vuitton luggage loaded into her Mercedes by a driver Charles didn't recognize. She'd taken the diamond bracelet he'd given her for their anniversary, left the wedding ring on the kitchen counter. Betty moved through the house like a ghost, maintaining routines that no longer mattered. She still prepared meals Charles didn't eat, still arranged fresh flowers in vases he didn't see, still opened curtains each morning to let in light that felt like an accusation. Charles tried to work, sat at his desk with spreadsheets and contracts that might as well have been written in another language. His assistant called 3 times about the Singapore deal. He let it go to voicemail. Marcus had resigned via email, a coward's exit. The board wanted answers. Charles had none to give. He couldn't sleep, couldn't close his eyes without seeing them together. So he lay awake, replaying 15 years of marriage like a film he was watching for the first time, finally seeing what had always been there. Their wedding day, Sylvia checking her phone during the ceremony. He thought she was nervous. Now he wondered who she'd been texting. Their 5th anniversary, he'd surprised her with a trip to Paris. She'd seemed bored, spending more time shopping than with him. He'd told himself she was just excited about the boutiques. Now he saw the disinterest in her eyes, the way she'd stiffened when he tried to hold her hand. Last Christmas, he'd given her a diamond necklace. She'd smiled, said thank you, and immediately asked about the property value of their Aspen cabin. He'd laughed, called her practical. Now he heard what she'd really meant. How much am I worth to you in assets? Every business trip he'd taken. Every late night at the office. Every time he'd said, I'm doing this for us, while she nodded with that patient, distant smile. She hadn't been waiting for him. She'd been waiting for him to leave. The signs had been everywhere. Her separate bedroom. Her separate life. The way she looked through him instead of at him. The way she talked about their marriage in terms of investments and portfolios, never in terms of love or partnership. He'd been so blind. So catastrophically, stupidly blind. Betty found him on the 4th day, still wearing the same clothes, staring at his wedding photos spread across the dining room table. She set down a tray, tea he wouldn't drink, toast he wouldn't eat. Mr. Charles, you need to rest. I gave her everything. His voice was hollow. Everything I had. Everything I was. Betty was quiet for a moment. Then gently, no, sir. You gave her everything you earned. You never gave her yourself. The words hit him like a slap. He looked up at her, this woman who'd watched his life unravel, who'd known the truth and stayed silent. Would it have made a difference? He asked. If I'd been different? If I'd worked less, been home more? Betty's eyes filled with something that looked like pity. I don't know, sir. But you would have known the truth sooner. And maybe that would have hurt less than this. She left him there, surrounded by photographs of a marriage that had never really existed. Charles picked up their wedding photo. Sylvia beautiful in white, him beaming like he'd won the lottery. And maybe he had thought that she was a prize, a trophy, proof that he'd finally made it. He'd never asked what she wanted, never asked if she was happy. He'd just kept giving her things, kept building his empire, kept telling himself that success was the same as love. Now he had everything he'd ever worked for, and he'd never felt more poor in his life. It was Betty who finally broke the silence on the 7th day. Charles sat in his study, staring at the same email he'd been trying to read for an hour, when she appeared with fresh coffee he hadn't asked for. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out rougher than he intended. All those years. You knew. Why didn't you say something? Betty set down the cup carefully, her hand steady despite the tremor in her voice. Because it wasn't my place, Mr. Charles. Not your place? He laughed bitterly. You watched me make a fool of myself. Watched me pour everything into a marriage that was already dead. And you said nothing. I wanted to. She sat down across from him. The first time in 10 years she'd sat in his presence without being invited. God knows I wanted to. But what was I supposed to say? Excuse me, sir, but your wife is sleeping with your business partner? Would you have believed me? Or would you have fired me and kept living the lie? Charles opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. She was right. He would have defended Sylvia. Would have accused Betty of jealousy, of overstepping, of anything except the truth. I saw it all, Betty continued, her voice soft but unwavering. The way she looked at you like you were an inconvenience. The way she complained to her friends on the phone about how boring you were, how obsessed with work. The way she'd light up when other men walked into a room but barely glanced at you when you came home. I watched you bring her flowers she'd throw away the next day. Watched you plan surprises she'd barely acknowledge. It broke my heart, sir. Every single day. Then why stay? Charles's voice cracked. Why watch that? Why not just quit? Betty's eyes glistened. Because someone needed to care about you, Mr. Charles. Even if you didn't notice. The words hung in the air between them. Charles felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the numbness that had consumed him. I was married once, Betty said quietly. 23 years old. My husband was a mechanic. We had nothing, a tiny apartment, second-hand furniture, more dreams than money. But he loved me. Really loved me. Not because I was beautiful or successful or could give him anything. He loved me because I made him laugh. Because we talked for hours about nothing and everything. Because when he looked at me, he saw me. What happened to him? Heart attack at 31. Gone before the ambulance arrived. She smiled sadly. I've spent 20 years cleaning houses, raising other people's children, watching other people's marriages. And I learned to tell the difference between love and convenience. Between partnership and transaction. Your marriage, Mr. Charles, it was never love. Not on her side. Maybe not on yours either. The truth of it pierced through him. I thought I loved her. You loved the idea of her, Betty said gently. You loved what she represented. Proof that you'd made it. That you weren't that poor kid from Koreatown anymore. But did you know her favorite book? What she dreamed about? What made her cry? Did you ever ask? Charles stared at his hands. He couldn't remember Sylvia's favorite anything. Couldn't remember the last real conversation they'd had. He'd known her dress size, her jewelry preferences, her shopping habits. But he'd never known her heart. And maybe, if he was honest, she'd never known his either. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, Betty whispered. But I'm not sorry I stayed. Someone needed to be here when it all fell apart. Charles looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. Not as his employee. Not as part of the furniture. But as a woman who'd witnessed his pain and stayed anyway. Who'd tried to warn him at the door. Who'd been the only person in his life who seemed to genuinely care whether he ate or slept or survived this. Thank you, he said, his voice breaking. For staying. Betty reached across the desk and squeezed his hand once, briefly. Her touch was warm, human, real. Then she stood, smoothing her apron, becoming the proper housekeeper again. But something had changed. Charles had spent 15 years married to a woman he'd never really known. And in 7 days of devastation, he'd finally seen the person who'd been there all along.